Watch out, nerds. There's a new bully on the block, and it's Falcons' sixth-round defensive lineman, Zion Logue.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. So, guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for a lifetime, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP, still going strong as the illustrious and very humble host of this illustrious podcast. You may also know me as Sirius Black, aka Mr. Drew, aka the Jolly Green Giant, aka the Iron that Sharpens the Iron, aka Mr. aka. And of course, I appreciate each and every one of you that go strong with me each and every day. All those everydayers, shout out to them who make this podcast their first listen or first watch each and every day. And to become an everyday, all you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode is our final scouting report of the Falcons 2024 draft class, talking about sixth-round defensive lineman Zion Logue out of the University of Georgia. And I know it's been a long time coming. These day three guys took longer than I thought just because I dilly-dallied. Late in May and early in June when it came to the film. But we're finally here, less than 2 weeks ahead of training camp, but we finally got here. And when we talk about Zion Logue, we'll talk about what his skill set is. We'll talk about, his potential to start for the Falcons, maybe sooner than people think, and we'll do some NFL player comps at the end to sort of talk about his projection and his potential ceiling and whatnot in the NFL. But we'll start with the skill set, and the thing that jumps off the screen when you watch Zion Logue play is the power, right? And I think you can make a pretty easy argument that of the four D linemen that the Falcons drafted, and none of those guys are lacking in the power department, that Zion Logue is arguably the strongest of that group in terms of what his film shows, right? He is basically a bully, right? And that's just exactly what Georgia and Kirby Smart wants. Like, Kirby Smart ain't into this cyberbullying nonsense. He's old school, right? He's about, dunking nerds' heads in toilets and giving them swirlies, stuffing nerds in lockers, when they're out at the roller rink with their crush, trying to impress them with their moves on the rink. Guys like Zion Logue and Georgia's guys are out here pantsing those guys and embarrassing them. And, it goes back to a conversation we had with Clint Shamblin of Locked On Bulldogs a couple of weeks ago, where he talked about, with Georgia, it's all about winning in the trenches. And Zion Logue is definitely a guy that can help you win there because of his strength and his power. And that's the thing I came away enjoying from Zion's film, watching him just sort of being a bully. And I that's just something that I enjoy watching. And so it leads to a dilemma, right? My heart tells me that I love watching this type of football player that Zion Logue is, but my head also tells me that, like, having watched prospects and similar prospects over the last 2.5 decades, that it tends to lead to a limited skill set and potential upside in the NFL. So that's the kind of dilemma with Zion Logue, who is a player that is, speaks to my heart, but my head is like, let's pump the brakes before we get too excited about. And some of that is owed to the fact that he has a limited pass rush potential, right? And we know that that's where the big bucks are. But watching his 8 games last year, I counted 33 wins, which is a similar number to how many wins I counted for Rukaroro. I think he had 32 in 9 games that I watched this past year. And 70% of Zion Logue's wins were categorized as power moves, right? And you compare that to someone like Rook, it was about 38% for him. Dorlus was 35%. Braylon Trice was 30%. So I think that's reflective of Zion Logue and his tremendous power, that he has a higher percentage. I think some of that is also owed to, he doesn't get as many opportunities to rush the quarterback as some of those guys did. He's most games he was being pulled off the field pretty regularly on third down. So he was a 2-down defender in college. And, that usually doesn't bode well for him being able to develop that third down skill set in the NFL if he couldn't even do that in college. But the way I would describe Zion Logue, he's a sort of one-note power rusher, doesn't really use a lot of pass rush moves. He will use a swim move to disengage, particularly after he starts a bull rush. He doesn't really rip that much. Like, I think I counted one rip move, and there was a couple of times that if he would rip under, the blocker's pads, he might have been able to be a little bit more disruptive. But generally speaking, he does a good job collapsing the pocket. It's sort of his signature move, I guess you would say, is he kind of bull rushes, a guard or a center or a tackle or whatever, and then he will either try to swim past them and try to get his hands up to bat down passes. And that's really what he probably does best. Now, part of the reason why you don't see as much pass rush production is he doesn't really have the athleticism to really finish those plays. And that applies both as a pass rusher and a run defender, that he doesn't make a ton of plays really in terms of in the backfield and whatnot. And we've talked before in the past about the correlation between a prospect's 3-cone and agility tests and their sack production in the NFL. And particularly when it comes to edge rushers, I don't have enough evidence to say that it correlates quite to the degree. I assume it doesn't correlate quite to the degree with interior guys. But if you at least look back over the last decade at the top 5 or so interior pass rushers, guys like Geno Atkins, J.J. Watt, Aaron Donald, Chris Jones, Fletcher Cox, etc., all of those guys tested really well in terms of, relatively speaking, in their agility metrics. And so I think there is some correlation there, just maybe not as stark as it is at the edge rusher position. But when you look at Zion Logue and how he tested in those areas, you can kind of tell why he didn't get a lot of sack production in the collegiate level. 7th percentile in short shuttle, 28th percentile in 3-cone. So well below average in both of those areas. And I only counted 1 sack and 0 quarterback hits in the 8 games I won out of the 32. For the sake of comparison, Rook Aurora had like a similar amount of pass rush wins, but had 7 combined sacks and hits. And even the sack that I counted for Zion Logue wasn't really a sack. It was rather a tackle for loss on a design like QB draw or whatever. And he got the sort of cleanup tackle on that play when he was able to kind of bully the offensive lineman and prevent the quarterback from, getting upfield on the design run. But I went and counted it as a sack just because I was like, I don't know if there's going to be any others of these on his film. But overall, he's a better run defender than he is a pass rusher. He's a guy that's very capable of clogging the run, controlling the point of attack. Again, has a little bit of disruptive capabilities because of that swim move. But that's not going to be necessarily his calling card in the NFL, getting a lot of that production. What's interesting about Zion Logue, and we've talked before about how he kind of projects to play nose tackle in Atlanta. But I actually think like he does, you can make an argument that his best film is playing more of that 5-tech, 3-4 defensive end role, right? And I would compare him to guys like Rook and Brandon Dorlus, who are also expected to play more of that role in the NFL. I could make an easy argument that Zion Logue's film in that specific role is probably better than either Rook's or Dorlus's in that role, right? That those guys are more projections on what they have the potential to be playing that sort of 3-4 defensive end role. And Zion Logue is already there just because I think Georgia asked him to play that a little bit more than Clemson asked, especially Clemson with Rook, and less or so with Oregon asked Dorlus to do that a decent amount. But I actually think Dorlus's like weakest film is in that specific role. So we'll see how that goes. But, because of that, you can make a case that he's more NFL ready than those guys, at least in that specific role. But as I mentioned, I don't think that's the role that the Falcons envision for him. We'll see. But I think they're more envisioning him to be in the mix at that nose tackle position. And there are plenty of reps of him playing that role at Georgia as Nazir Stackhouse's sort of primary backup. There's good film of him doing that. But the more and more film I watched, the more I saw struggles with him taking on double teams. And if you're going to play nose tackle, whether it's in a 4-man front or a 3-man front, you're going to see a lot of double teams, right? The center and one of those guards are typically going to double team you a lot, not only as in run defense, but also in pass rush. And I think Zion struggled a little bit with that, dealing with that. I think most of his was balance issues, and that may be another part of the limited athleticism that shows up in that regard. Like there were just too many instances on film where I thought he got a little overextended taking on a double team and would lose his balance and wind up on the ground. And as you know, you can't really make plays when you're on the ground. You got to get up off the turf to make those plays. And so I do think he has arguably, he's arguably ahead of the rest of this rookie class when it comes to being a day one contributor as a 3-4 defensive end. But because the Falcons have a vested interest in both Rook and Dorlus in that specific role, they're going to get opportunities over someone like a Zion, not to mention the other veteran players that the Falcons have that can play that role, like Grady Jarrett, David Onyemata, Taquan Graham, Zach Harrison, etc. And so it's going to be hard for Zion, even if he does have that sort of skill set, that he could be a plug and play contributor in a rotation in that 3-4 defensive end role. It's going to be hard for him to see the field. And what's interesting with him playing the nose tackle position is it's going to be a challenge. It's going to be an uphill battle for Zion Logue to make the roster. And we've mentioned before how of this draft class, Zion probably has the longest road ahead of him to make the 53-man roster, but also weirdly has kind of the shortest path to being a starter should he actually hit the ground running in that nose tackle role. And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But first, guys, I want to tell you about passion, drive, and patience, because it is the winning formula for winning championships, and is also the winning formula for keeping your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, whatever parts you're looking for, whether you're into speed, power, or style. We know Zion Logue definitely into power. eBay Motors has got you covered. I got my seatbelt covers that I ordered a couple of weeks ago coming probably next week from eBay Motors. I got a 05 Hyundai Elantra, and I'm going to ride that thing till the wheels fall off, and the wheels probably will fall off at some point in the next 6 months. But, rather than using duct tape to fix all of my car's problems, I head on over to eBay, where they have over 122 million parts for your ride or die. And they had exactly what I was looking for with the seatbelt covers, because eBay's guaranteed fit means that your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time of your money back, because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash, baby. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car an MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay guarantee fit only available to U.S. customers. So, guys, I want to tell you about Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you each and every day to bring you the biggest stories, can't miss analysis, opinions, news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So, as I said, I think Zion probably has the toughest road ahead to making the 53-man roster, but potentially the shortest road of anybody in this draft class to start games this year. And that doesn't necessarily make sense at first glance, but we've discussed a couple of times when projecting the 53-man roster, the Falcons have a lot of bodies on their interior D-line. And so that's arguably the position, other than maybe quarterback, that they're deepest at the roster. And I think they'll potentially keep 7 guys on their 53-man roster because of how deep they are there. But I would probably, if I'm ranking them today, rank Zion 10th in that hierarchy. And if you're curious how I would rank them, it's like in terms of best chances of making the roster, Grady's 1, David Onyemata's 2, Zach Harrison 3, Ruka Roro 4, Brandon Dorlus 5, Laquale London 6, Taquan Graham 7, Kentavious Street 8, Eddie Goldman 9th, and then Zion Logue would be 10th in that group. And to me, without multiple injuries and or guys like Dorlus and Zach Harrison being full-time edges, which I don't think they'll be, but we'll see. Without sort of a lot of those bodies, being moved out of the way, it's going to be hard for Zion Logue to stick on the roster, just given where he is in the hierarchy on that totem pole. But what's notable about that is the 2 guys that are theoretically ahead of him at the nose tackle position in Laquale London and Eddie Goldman were pretty low on that list. Like, neither one of those guys are locks to make the roster. And so in a world where Eddie Goldman decides he's not going to play football because he gets to experience at Georgia Heat, and we know that the 2 things that are undefeated in this world are Father Time and the Georgia Heat, right? There's been multiple instances over the last 25 years where a Falcon player has quit on the first day of training camp. I could think back to like Nate Davis back in 97, Lance Moore like 7-8 years ago. I'm sure there's other guys that you guys can come to mind, but so that's part of the reason why I'm not expecting Eddie Goldman to stick on the roster this year, but we'll see if he actually makes it. We'll see. But in a world where Eddie Goldman with the Georgia Heat, rears its ugly head and gets Eddie Goldman out the paint, as they say, at that point in time, Zion technically has like a 50-50 shot of starting games if he could beat out Laquale London. Now, I think Laquale London is much further ahead of Zion Logue at this point in terms of being able to do the nose tackle stuff, taking on double teams, controlling the line of scrimmage, et cetera, because we've seen Laquale London do it to a pretty decent level against NFL competition last year. than what we've seen from Zion Logue. But, you never know. Many odd things could happen over the course of training camp. And so if you claim to be from the future and you sat there and said Zion Logue actually starts week 1 against the Steelers, like, I wouldn't think you're a crazy person, is basically what I'm getting at. And so, I think ultimately for Zion Logue and his long-term development, again, that's the short term, there is a possibility that he get on the field, but he does kind of need to get on the field in the short term because I think it's going to be critical to his long-term development because, you got to play, right? And I'm sure some of you guys are like, no duh, Aaron. Like, that's true of most players. Like, it's hard to improve and develop from the bench. Players need reps and whatnot. But, we know when it comes to the draft game, draft is very hit and miss. But the one thing that is pretty consistent and pretty reliable that we can count on is that early round picks are going to be, quote unquote, given opportunities to play, while late round picks have to earn those opportunities. And it's going to be hard for Zion to earn those opportunities if he's not on the 53-man roster, is basically what I'm getting at. And that will potentially open the door for the Falcons to potentially upgrade their nose tackle position next offseason, right? You asked the question for the Georgia fans out there, like, what's stopping the Falcons from drafting Nazir Stackhouse in round 3 or 4 next year, right? And I know the Georgia fans are like, him playing for Georgia is what's stopping them, because we know the Falcons don't believe in drafting the good Georgia players until they get to round 6, right? But other than that, you make a fair point. But, whether it's Stackhouse, whether it's a free agent, whether it's another draft pick, Zion Logue isn't going to stop the team from making an upgrade at that spot from the bench, right? Now, maybe LaCale London plays well enough this year if he winds up winning the nose tackle spot that the Falcons, will pump the brakes on trying to upgrade that nose tackle position next year. But the point is that Zion Logue, especially if he's not on the roster and can't get on the field, basically has no control over whether or not the Falcons are going to potentially bring in a better player than him. And that's going to limit his potential to develop long-term, because he's always going to be stuck behind somebody in the future. And that's why projecting these players can be difficult, right? We can accurately tell the present situation, but who knows what's going to happen in the future. And we had a similar conversation 3 years ago when it came to Ade Ogundeji, right? Where we talked about Ade's ceiling not necessarily being high enough at edge that he's going to struggle to stick long term, because the Falcons should have little to no problem finding better options over the next 2 off seasons at that edge rusher group. And they did, drafting Arnold Ebiketie and D'Angelo Malone, and then last year with Zach Harrison, and then arguably this year with Braylon Trice. And all of a sudden, Ade Ogundeji's out of a job and can't even get to training camp to compete for a job. And you could see a similar sort of career path for Zion Logue, not because he lacks an ability, but like Ade Ogundeji, he probably projects as a back-end rotational guy, as opposed to someone that has that sort of starting upside that some of these other players that the Falcons have drafted at least have the potential to be. Whether they wind up living up to that remains to be seen. And so that's going to be the challenge for Zion Logue, is just long-term. Like, he's going to be one of those players, maybe not quite to the degree that Ade was, just because I think Zion's just probably a slightly better player that projects a little bit better to the NFL. But those are guys that are relatively easy to replace. And so that's going to be the difficult thing for Zion Logue. And that's going to get us to what we'll do to wrap up today's episode, which is talking about some projections for him, looking at Zion's floor, ceiling, and eye level, and looking at some NFL players that have preceded him that are similar in that regard. And we'll break that down to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So when we talk about floor, ceiling, and eye level, for those of you that are new here, this is something I've consistently done over the last 6 years with all the Falcons draft picks since the 2018 draft. And to me, the floor is what I think a player is day one in the NFL. And anybody who's been listening regularly over that 6-year period knows that I think this is the most important projection, because it's going to kind of set the tone for what you're going to be in the NFL. And we spend way too much time talking about a ceiling, which is in my case, like, what I think the max potential of a player can be with, the right circumstances, health, durability, development, all those various things. What's the best case scenario for each one of these players? And then the eye level is the halfway point between the floor and the ceiling, which to me is the more realistic expectation. And as we've discussed a number of times now in some of these recent projections, me going back a couple of weeks ago and looking at my previous projections over the last 6 years, based off my projections, again, only about 15% of the players the Falcons have drafted have reached their eye levels. About 40% or 15% reach their ceilings. 40% reach their eye levels, right? So that gives you kind of the odds. Now, for me, the three projections I had for Zion Logue, the floor to me was Jalen Dalton. I got to get my former Falcon in there. The ceiling to me, max potential, was Austin Johnson. And the eye level in between those was Shamar Stephen. Right now, with Jalen Dalton, do you remember Jalen Dalton? Probably most of you don't. But he played about 150 snaps in the back half of the 2022 season for the Falcons. I think Taquan Graham getting hurt was sort of the catalyst for him getting more opportunities. Dalton, to me, was a much better athlete than Zion was coming out of UNC. Dalton back in 2019. But by the time he got to Atlanta, he was probably like 20 pounds heavier than what he was coming out of college, and just kind of a big, powerful clogger that could control the line of scrimmage, but wasn't necessarily a guy that had a lot of juice to make a ton of plays. And that's where that comp stems from, where I think Zion day one can come in, be a back-end rotational guy, not going to make a lot of plays. Like Dalton only had 1 tackle for loss and 3 pressures in the 7 games he played for the Falcons in 2022, but he's really out there just to keep the other guys fresh, right? And especially now that the Falcons theoretically are much deeper at the D tackle position today than they were in 2022, that role has value, but there's only a limited value to that, right? Other thing that Jalen Dalton did when he was in Atlanta, he played up and down the line of scrimmage, played some nose, played some 3 tech, played some 5 tech, all that sort of stuff. And I think Zion is capable of doing all of those things, right? But, can he build off of that floor and become a more effective player down the road? And that's going to be the challenge for Zion Logue. And that's where the eye level and ceiling comps come into play. The eye level comp of Shamar Stephen played 8 years in the NFL, most of which come with the Vikings, started out as the backup to Linval Joseph there back in 2014, eventually worked his way into a starting lineup, right? But he wasn't a playmaker there, right? Career high of 11 pressures in a season, averaged 8 pressures roughly per season, but was a solid run defender and kind of made up for the lack of pass rush ability there. He was Shamar Stephen was basically a Mike Zimmer favorite, right? He's that sort of do your job, maintain your gap integrity type of player, capable of being able to play multiple techniques up and across the line of scrimmage, including that nose tackle position. And again, it goes back to something that Clint Shamblin of Locked On Bulldogs talked about with Zion Logue, was that's exactly what role he had in Georgia, which was to do your job on that defensive line that had much more talented players, multiple first-round picks and whatnot. But he continued to see the field despite playing with all these future first-round picks and current first-round picks, because coaches are endeared to that guy, similar to Mike Zimmer with Shamar Stephen. And, you look at the Vikings situation where they had much more talented, guys on their defensive line like Linval Joseph, Sheldon Richardson, Sharif Floyd, Everson Griffin, Brian Robertson, Daniil Hunter throughout Stephen's time in Minnesota. But he – the talent level of those other guys paled in comparison to Shamar Stephen, or I guess Stephen's talent level paled in comparison to those other guys, but he was the guy that was willing to do the dirty work. And that's going to help those other guys shine because they don't have to sort of do all the dirty work and whatnot. And that to me is Stephen's was able to carve out, a career over the better part of a decade. So clearly there's a role and opportunity for those types of players in the NFL. And that's what I sort of think a good version, the more likely the developed version of Zion Logue is potentially going to be, which is he'll have that opportunity. But the challenge is Stephen got an opportunity right away to play in Minnesota as a rookie, right? And then especially with the injuries that sort of, derailed Sharif Floyd's career, got more opportunities to play as time wore on as an injury replacement. And that kind of earned him that trust from the coaching staff. And we'll see if, again, can't predict the future. We can only make guesses, even though I'm a prophet. But, sometimes divine visions come to me. But, blasphemy. Anyway, but, that's going to be the challenge for Zion Logue, because I don't know if he's going to get those opportunities to shine in order to reach that development. That's why it's important that he plays early on in his career. But, the ceiling with Austin Johnson, very similar type of player with Shamar Stephen, just more capable of making a few more plays. Started off in Tennessee, was a starter at nose tackle in 2018 when Dean Pease was the defensive coordinator there, playing with better defensive linemen like Jarrell Casey and Jeffrey Simmons in those years. Then went to the Giants in 2020, played with Leonard Williams, played with Dexter Lawrence, Dalvin Tomlinson along the interior. He did start in 2021, had his most productive year in terms of 3.5 sacks, 27 pressures. And so that to me is kind of the ceiling for what a Shamar Stephen Zion Logue potentially could be. I think Johnson is in Buffalo, and he's going to be more of that dirty work guy playing behind, an Ed Oliver, who's going to be primarily a pass rusher, but you could put Austin Johnson in there on early downs to keep Ed Oliver fresh for those passing downs. Another player I considered for the ceiling comp was A'Shawn Robinson, who's another sort of plus run defender, but offers very little as a pass rusher. But the reason I went with Austin Johnson is just because A'Shawn Robinson has primarily and almost exclusively been a 3-4 defensive end throughout his career. And although, again, as I mentioned earlier, I think Zion Logue could do that if that was what the Falcons envisioned for him. Johnson is a better comp just because Johnson has spent several years starting as a nose tackle. And so, again, the ideal version of, I think, what the Falcons vision for Zion Logue is that guy that can play up and down the line of scrimmage, play D-end in the 3-4, play nose tackle, etc., like Austin Johnson, while A'Shawn Robinson is pretty much exclusively a D-end in that scheme. So overall, again, my final conclusion on Zion Logue is a player that I like. I'm looking forward to watching him in the third and fourth quarters of some of these preseason games just to see him bully some of these third-string offensive linemen. But I don't necessarily think the stars are aligned for him to make an immediate impact. And I think because there will be opportunities for the Falcons to find better options in the near future, I don't know if the stars are going to necessarily align for him to reach his eye level and his ceiling in Atlanta. So again, if I'm betting, again, I'm hoping, we're hoping this bet fails, but like I'm not betting him to be significantly more than what Jalen Dalton was here in Atlanta. But again, a lot of that will depend on his ability to get on the field early on. And again, I think if he does play, even as a rookie, he can contribute in positive ways for this football team. But, I think the way that the Falcons kind of envision this draft class, taking multiple bites of the apple, each one of these guys, of these four guys they put on the defensive line, you could see a reality where the Falcons, all four of these guys turn into starters, right? Where Zion Logue is that sort of starting one tech nose tackle. Brandon Doris is that sort of penetrating, disruptive 3-tech, D end in the 3-4. Ruka Roro's the 5-tech, playing an opposite 3-4 D end spot. And then you have Braylon Trice, as that pure edge rusher. And certainly there is a reality where, all four of these guys develop into starters for this football team. I tend to be skeptical of many things, but I don't think we're necessarily living in that reality just because I think the circumstances are going to dictate that. But we'll see, how accurate that looks in the years to come. But, we'll see if the Falcons, I think in some of those instances, the Falcons already have better players than some of those guys in those roles. So it's going to be a challenge for some of them to carve out those roles. And I think in other instances, especially in the case of Zion Logue, there's not a whole lot stopping them from getting better players than those guys in future drafts or in free agency and whatnot. And so that's going to be the challenge for not only Zion Logue, but the entirety of this draft class of can they make enough impact plays early on for us to sit here and go like, yeah, that guy is a long-term solution. So that's going to be the challenge for Zion Logue. That's going to be especially for Zion Logue in comparison to the other guys, because those other guys are somewhat insulated by the fact that they were early round picks. And so they're going to be quote unquote given probably 3 years of opportunities before the Falcons are ready to move on, while Zion Logue, theoretically they could move on next year. That's kind of the situation that he may find himself in. So again, a player I like, but I just don't think the circumstances are really lined up for him to show his best self here in Atlanta. But we'll see. Again, we'll be rooting for him in that regard. But that is it, guys. We are finally done with this draft class. We'll have some guests on next week, including, I think our next episode will be Sam Monson of PFF talking about the Falcons training camp and what's in store for this upcoming season. We'll probably revisit the pass rush later this week and talk about Arnold Ebiketie's potential to sort of be that difference maker up front, and we'll see. We still have a couple of more big topics I want to get into before training camp opens up. So that's all in store for you next week on the podcast. Of course, we got still more Falcons historian player shootouts as we're getting deeper and deeper into this thing to crown who's the trivia master when it comes to Falcons legends over the last 20 years. So that's also in store for you. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. All you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. For your second listen today or tomorrow, check out Locked On Sports Today, Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Bulldogs, Locked On Hawks, Locked On Braves. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.